Hello, welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we'll be reviewing All the Beauty and the Bloodshed. Directed by Laura Poitras, All the Beauty and the Bloodshed shows rare footage and intimate interviews providing insight into the life and work of renowned photographer and activist Nan Goldin. So Matt, what did you think of All the Beauty and the Bloodshed?
I really enjoyed this documentary. I thought it was very effective, and I found it to be very emotionally captivating. As you mentioned, this documentary follows Nan Goldin, and she is a very renowned photographer and artist, and also activist. And basically, she has been struggling with opioid addiction during a period of her life. And one of those in particular is Oxycontin. If you're not familiar with the news as of the past couple of years, Oxycontin was produced by Purdue Pharma, which is owned by the Sackler family. And so they were found to have known that this drug was very addictive, which has led to countless deaths. So her role as an activist in this documentary is being explored of her trying to remove the Sackler name from all these very renowned museums that stretch across the globe. I mean, we're talking about the Louvre and we're talking about the Guggenheim.
I think an important bit of context about the Sackler family is they're known for making these really intense and large contributions to nonprofit art institutions. And they have all of these wings named after them and all of these places named after them and very famous art museums. So that's a way for them to effectively wash their hands of their sins with opioids. So one of the things I like so much about what Nan does in this film and in her life is that she uses her power as an artist because she specifically targets museums that she's in the permanent collection. And she's willing to lose her career as a photographer in order to get the name off of the wing. So her power as an artist is being utilized for these really benevolent purposes, which is what we hope anyone that makes a name for themselves would do.
This documentary is following that story as well as giving us a little bit backstory into her childhood and why she is an activist in a certain sense. I think in terms of this documentary, it does require a lot of patience. I found the first 30 to 40 minutes being very slow moving. It's building a lot of backstory and nuance to her as a person, which is very integral to the end of this documentary. And when the end of the documentary does hit, it really hit me like a truck. And I found it to be very emotionally resonant and just an extremely well done documentary.
Yeah, this movie is really prescient actually because there was a pretty buzzy miniseries on Hulu called Dope Sick, which shows the Sackler family and some of the, I'm not sure if they're fictionalized or real people that started selling Oxycontin. There's also a great doc on HBO called Crime of the Century that goes into Oxycontin's kind of origins and how it was marketed to be the first non-addictive painkiller, which obviously turned out to not be quite true at all. I think what the film does is that it shows how somebody's trauma and their personal hardships can lead to a life of activism. They can turn their trauma into really powerful indignation against institutions and governments that are failing their people. So what this film has to do is it has to educate us on Nan, which is telling us about her life and her trauma, but then it has to somehow tie it into her activism and make a greater point about opioid addiction and what led us to this point in the first place. And the film does that really successfully. At first, it feels like you're kind of on two different tracks before they merge together later in the film.
Yeah, it's this kind of high wire act, as I know you've used that term before, that it has to balance these two distinct stories about her life and her role as an activist. And it has a lot to say about institutions and how they fail people, but also this hopeful end, which it does get into, of these things can be changed and we do have power. And it really shows the power of activism at work. It's a part of this documentary that happens towards the end where the names do get removed and there's this just immense joy in her. You could see something lifted from her conscious that has been sitting there in a way that I thought was extremely powerful. Another thing that we do have to get into is her photography, because the way that they weave her photography, this documentary isn't played in chronological order. It is built up in pieces to build a story for you to understand, which is one of the best things about it in terms of Laura's directing here. There's this one part where she does talk about these images being a remembering of her past and proof that things in her life existed and were real. This was one of the most powerful things I enjoyed about this documentary, is seeing these photographs and how they almost resembled the time in which she was living. There is sense of joy at certain parts of her life where she has a lot of friends and she's going out and she's doing a lot of things and she's working at this bar, which is a very positive experience in her life. And her photographs emulate that. And then there's a period of her life which is darker when the AIDS crisis hits, and her images are becoming more somber. There's like a darkness to them that wasn't there before. The way her photography exudes such reality and authenticity.
Well, I'm not very good at interpreting photographs. For as good as I am at, I don't want to sound arrogant, but as good as I am about interpreting films, I feel like photography is something that I just really don't have a lot of expertise in. So I kind of leaned more on you and what you thought of the photograph, since you have some of a background there. But one of the things that somebody says in the documentary was that her work is very political, and it was political from the start. And I want to talk a little bit about Nan's anger in this film, because she has this great line where she talks about the Sackler family, and she says, the only thing that you can feel is outrage. And you hear me say this all the time, so this is repetitious for you, but I always think that anger kind of gets a bad rap, like you're not supposed to be angry, but I don't think any great change has come in the world without someone first getting angry about it. So Nan has a great way of harnessing her anger and using that for the greater good, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, it's really taking that anger and putting it into action, which is something that is required to make a change. And there's these wonderful scenes that are visually captivating as well, of them doing these protests in the museums where they label a bunch of pill bottles, empty pill bottles with names, and then they throw them into a pond, or they throw them on the ground, and then they all lie there to resemble the people that have died from being addicted to Oxycontin. It showed how passion and anger can be driven into activism, which in turn drives itself into a response. And I know some people might think that this is political in a sense, but to me, it's like human rights. It's like, okay, a bad deed was done. Somebody needs to be held accountable for that. People died, and this drug has been proven to be addicted. And of course, there's been lawsuits, and these lawsuits have gone through, and there's billions of dollars. So there's proof. It's been proven. Purdue Pharma is going bankrupt. So like, this is a real thing that happened. And to show in such raw terms how this family can get away with this and just escape with their billions of dollars and be okay in the end is pretty remarkable. There's this intense scene towards the end of the documentary where in court, all these victims, family members of people who died, get to speak in court. And the court is done through Zoom because it was conducted during the pandemic. And the Sackler family had to be present for this hearing and listen to these testimonials. It was very intriguing to me because there's one person of the Sackler family who is not on he's on the call, but he's not visually present at all. That in itself said something. There was one, a gentleman who looked visibly distraught, like he was actually being affected by these testimonials. And then there was an older woman who seemed very I don't know, she had this rich presence about her where she was very formal and she had nothing on her face. Yeah. She was just almost glass-eyed, and I'm just like, does she have any feeling at all? In a way, seeing them having to confront this face-to-face and have it be publicized, I think said so much about them as a family.
Yeah, there's something that her friend David says in the film that I found really insightful, where he was actually talking about AIDS, but it works just as well for the opioid crisis. And he says, if I had taken my dead friend and put him in my car and dropped them on their doorstep, they would probably be really affected by that. But to read 200,000 dead, 300,000 dead in the newspaper, you just kind of say that's awful and move on. It's really interesting because it shows how actually knowing a person and having a personal connection instead of this huge number of dead will actually affect somebody a lot more. And to me, that shows the power of storytelling, not only of this film, but why we tell stories at all, because those personal connections are really what change people's lives. Going back to what you were talking about with activism. So when you and I were in Paris, we encountered a protest. And we say, wow, we think there's a protest going on. And we kind of put it together. And what was the first thing we did? We started Googling, what are they protesting about in Paris today? And we encountered a yellow jacket protest and a protest for environmental policies. And the first thing we did was Google it and read about it and see how we felt about it. Who was right? Who was wrong? Was there a mix of of these kind of nuanced and political ideas on both sides that we could identify with. But that really goes to show you that making a big deal out of these things and interrupting, we had to walk the long way to an art museum. How terrible, right? That little interruption got us to learn about something that's really important to the people protesting.
So as I was talking about earlier, this film has a lot of backstory in the beginning of the documentary, talking about her childhood and growing up, her parents, her sister, who unfortunately had committed suicide. When this film mirrors how institutions failed the AIDS pandemic, and how institutions are failing this drug crisis, and how also institutions ended up failing her sister. And there's a bunch of things that are revealed about her sister committing suicide that her parents withheld from her. There's this interesting scene where she uses a clip of footage, like archive footage, from a documentary she never completed with an interview of her parents. And her mother comes in with a quotation that her sister had on her body when she had committed suicide.
It's a quote from Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and it basically says that the only thing you can hope to learn in your life is something about yourself, and that will fill you with inextinguishable regret, quote unquote. It's a very eloquent quote, but also quite a dark quote.
That note is something her mother still held with her till her old age. I sense that that suicide of her sister also played out in a way as a protest. Her mom is now so intrinsically changed, seemingly, by this quote that she keeps on her. All these things built to not just bringing awareness to these things, but also solutions. And one of those is harm reduction sites where people can go to get help. And they could go to get their drugs tested so that way people who are addicted can take them in a safe space with medical supervision as they deal with this crisis that they're facing on their own. That is one of the most fantastic things about this documentary, is it tells you the human element, it tells you the problem, the people who are the problem, the institutions that are failing, and the solutions. How can we fix it and how can we save people? And that is the main importance of this story that, you have to get across right at the end. And they completely nailed this in the documentary, I thought.
Yeah, one of the most unfortunate mischaracterizations of activism is that it's just people screaming and yelling. It's sound and fury signifying nothing, right? And it's not that. It's really not that. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is. But really, the real type of activists, the people that are really doing things that are changing the framework of how America works and saving lives, those people, they're not doing it because they want to scream and hold a sign. It's a hard lifestyle. It's not something that you do unless you have an extraordinary amount of passion. So one, I think, preconception about documentaries, not necessarily for me, but maybe a lot of people who watch documentaries or maybe watch the news, is that it should be unbiased, which I would say that this film is not. That doesn't necessarily bother me. I think the film has a point of view. I have seen biased documentaries that have bothered me and ones that have not. One of the first things that comes to thought is Michael Moore. Michael Moore makes documentaries, and I think that he has an idea in mind and he forms the documentary around that idea. Sometimes that has worked. Bowling for Columbine is like an absolutely amazing movie. Sometimes it doesn't work. I've seen documentaries. We could talk about an anti-vax documentary that has an idea and forms a documentary around it. So I just wanted to get your perspective, because the film is, I think, seething with outrage at the Sackler family, and it is not attempting a nuanced approach to their crimes. And I guess my question is, do you think that's permissible? Do you think the film is at all missing their point of view? Or are the Sacklers so indisputably evil, or maybe so indisputably ignorant to the damage that they're causing, that they really don't deserve a point of view?
It almost reminds me of like Glass Onion, how some people are just rich and stupid and they don't know what they're doing, but that doesn't mean they're not culpable for their actions.
Yeah, sure.
I do think there is nuance probably in the Sackler family about this subject. And the only reason I say that is because of watching them hear those testimonials and seeing the man, and I'm sorry, I don't know their names, but the man who was visibly looked upset by hearing these testimonials. And I could just picture him after this call talking with his family members and maybe having a different viewpoint that is more kinder to all the people that he had to hear these testimonials from than some other family members.
Yeah.
I do think there might be some nuance there, and the documentary is what gave me that indication in that particular moment. A general consensus that I have about this is, yes, it does come across a little bit biased, but it has the receipts to back it up. And that's the most important thing, is it has court documents and mandated court settlements that they have to pay.
And emails from the Sacklers,
Emails from the
correspondence. Yeah, there's a lot to suggest they knew the harm that they were causing without doing anything about it.
Some might see it as political because it is calling for political action. I feel like that's what politics is. You are calling for political action for the system to change so somebody's life can get better. And in this case, so people's lives can be saved. So yes, it's political. Yes, it's biased, but it's advocating for the right things. And it's focused on showing why those things are important, the lives that are effective, and bringing the heart element to it. Because I think so many people look at these political issues and they just sweep them aside so easily, but they don't understand that they come from a place of great personal importance to people.
Yeah, in a sense, what we were talking about with activism actually applies to this film too, because I went into this film knowing all about the Sacklers because I had watched the two TV shows, Dopesick and Crime of the Century, that I mentioned at the beginning of this. I knew nothing about Nan Goldin, so I learned a whole lot about her, and maybe she was mentioned actually in these documentaries, and I just didn't know who she was. But I found all of that really fascinating. But if somebody had never heard of the Sacklers, never heard of Nan Goldin, just heard that this film is really good, and they went to see it, the first thing they're going to do is what we did in France, which is Google what this is all about or get their education there. Maybe they're going to leave as outraged as Nan has been her entire life about this. So maybe that's worth the point of view that they have.
So you ready to go to grades?
Yeah, I'm going to give this an A. I haven't seen a ton of documentaries this year. We still have some catching up to do in that regard, but this is undoubtedly one of my favorite films of the year. We talked about the construction a little bit, but I think for a documentary, this film is so amazingly structured, not only with how it has this high wire act that you use, that it has these two different stories that need to converge and tell you something with some thematic heft, but I think that the way it's structured and what it uses as its storytelling devices are actually pretty unconventional. That this film, this documentary, feels a lot more abstract than I've seen of more kind of cut and dry vanilla documentaries that we've seen. Even, say, Crime of the Century that I've mentioned a few times on HBO is very talking heads, information, your very typical documentary. I think this film takes a lot more chances with its structure, which I really appreciate. And in its last 30 minutes, it is just a very powerful artistic statement.
I couldn't agree more. I also give this documentary an A. I also agree it was one of my favorite films of the year. And with that said, there was something you had mentioned that I do want to tap into. There are these scenes where she is giving narration, talking about the period of time that they're in while showing a slideshow that she had made. She is famous for these slideshows that she's made over the course of her career. It was a culmination of all these slideshows bringing together an entire life, which I thought in itself was such a powerful statement as well.
And that's it for a review of All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, which is now in theaters. What did you think of this film? Let us know in the comments, and we will see you next time.